Major news organizations, including ours, are calling on Israel to allow international journalists in and out of Gaza. Right now, the world depends on local journalists and humanitarians to get any information out. Israel so far has not budged, but an American journalist, Afif Nassouli, managed to get in, volunteering as a medical worker, and he spent his off hours reporting. He wrote about the suffering he saw in The Intercept, and here he is talking about that with Hari Srinivasan.
Christian, thanks. Afif Nassouli, thanks so much for joining us. One of the reasons that we have you on is it's very rare, at this point almost impossible, to get any first-line reporting out of Gaza. And you went there for 7 weeks, and you went as an aid worker, but you were kind of reporting on the side. In the last couple of weeks, logistics and aid delivery has come into the spotlight a bit more with the crisis of just starvation, access to food, however you want to put it, for the people of Gaza right now. So tell me, what were you able to see? Because what we are hearing is that the majority of Palestinians do not have enough food to eat and are in significant health risk of death.
Yeah. I saw this sort of escalate as I was there. The blockade started March 2nd. I was there by March 27th. By the time I was there, people were rationing and thinking about how to make sure they would have food if it got worse. And it was just getting worse. It was just the beginning at that time. So I experienced it as seeing 170 community kitchens dwindle and dwindle and dwindle until there were just dozens of them. And then I experienced volunteering at one that eventually had to close down and just had potatoes on June 1st, I remember, from some other organization. So you see this population getting emaciated. I had a friend who lost over 100 pounds in the last 2 years. I have a friend at 6 foot who's 119 pounds. People were just losing weight, and we were all just eating as little as we possibly could so that we could eat again tomorrow. Even I lost 10 to 12 pounds and got sick once because I was like subsisting on just a few calories, and I was also sick from something else, and I just couldn't sort of get through it. But it looks like a million things happening at once. It looks like doctors also operating on people that are skin and bones, because it's different for everybody. Everybody has a sort of a different privilege. But then when there's a blockade for months, you're all just no one's privileged. There's this equal suffering happening. I remember people asking for tain or flour, and just having, being able to speak Arabic and telling them back that we don't have flour either. Like, just because I have this Glia vest on we just don't have flour either. And I was thankful that we could speak Arabic and that I was with Ghazawi colleagues, because it was so hard to see people struggling in the streets and begging on the level, and with the frequency and the amount of people. Everybody was hungry. Everybody.
So give me some idea of what somebody in Gaza subsists on for calories on an average day.
I would say it's changed over time. It was always rice. We ate a lot of rice, a lot of lentils, chickpeas. There is produce that's fresh. There was for a while. It tripled in price because a lot of farmland is not, there's nothing you can cultivate on it. It's destroyed, like 83%, I think.
Because of the bombing, the farmland is no longer farmable.
Yes, exactly. Because of bombing. Fishing fleets destroyed. So what you have are like tomatoes and eggplants on the market, but they're so expensive, and there's not many of them. So we were eating food that we brought. I brought a whole suitcase of canned tuna that I would mostly pass out and subsist on. And there were biscuits that I think that the UN passed out for. There was still stuff on the market when I was there. I have not been there since June. It has gotten considerably worse. So now people are subsisting on the same thing I was subsisting on, but for instead of eating once a day, I've heard a lot of people are eating once every couple of days at this point. So it's catastrophic. It's become catastrophic.
And then let's talk a little bit about what used to be part of the infrastructure and how people got food, which was the UN and USAID. What have happened to those sources?
So those seem to have been done away with over time. I mean, basically Israel is sort of in charge of whatever goes in, whatever comes out. Every coordination you do is through Israel. They replaced the UN-backed system with the GHF, which is American-run and also Israeli-controlled. So what happened was 400 locations across Gaza became four that are barely operational, semi-daily, has a Facebook site to tell people when they're operating. If they're operating, they might not be because of security or maintenance. I've had people go and it just not be open. Also, it's just very disorganized. The UN system was, the type of system that delivered food to people, made hot meals. Like, it was really backed by local experts who really understood what their communities needed, and it was run by Ghazawis in many ways, doing the sort of heavy lifting. And now you just have these, you're replacing expertise, a lot of care, a lot of real social work, a lot of community care with men in weapons, men just sort of holding machine guns from a distance and just sort of letting aid sit there and watching people fight over it because they're desperate and hungry. It's definitely to me an obvious strategy to further eradicate a people that are on a land that other people want.
So tell me, you probably talked to people who had made that trek to one of these four sites, right? So if you force all these people away from 400 sites to four sites, I imagine the natural tendency is there's going to be a huge spike in demand, and you see these huge crowds of people waiting. What is that process like? Well, how do people describe that to you?
So I have one source who's in his mid-20s named Khalil. And Khalil told me about, I think it was mid-June that he was visiting a GHF site near the Netzarim corridor. He had gone really early in the morning. It was still dark out. And he was saying that by the time he got there, he went with his two brothers and his friends. So it was, as usual, young men who are kind of given the responsibility to sort of brave the trek. They have to walk a few kilometers. Wherever they are, they have to walk a few kilometers for sure. And there's no fuel, nor can you drive because the Israelis won't allow that. It's very dangerous. You might be targeted. So you have to walk. And you have to walk while you haven't eaten in a while. At least, even if you've had something in your mouth, it's not been a lot. It's not been a lot for the last couple of days. So imagine Khalil, who has already lost nearly 50 pounds, from what I understand, since a year and a half ago, is with his brothers and his friend. And it's early morning. There's thousands of people already there. They're, from what he told me, barefoot, and sort of just, it's intense. It's intense because people seem really nervous. They're, again, not even again, I don't think I've said this, but Gaza is loud. The quadcopters are incessant, and sometimes they're near and sometimes they're far, but they're always buzzing. They're always buzzing, and there's bombs always present. They're ever present, and they're sometimes near and they're sometimes far. So there's a lot of noise while you're doing this trek, and you're getting to these people who are intensely hungry and hoping to find a morsel of food and are willing to do a lot to get it. And I remember he told me that he was waiting in line and there was just thousands of people, and then shots rang out and he just started running. And that was his experience, basically getting in line, seeing soldiers in the distance, seeing sort of other non-Israeli soldiers maybe nearer to the aid, and then sort of waiting for it to start happening. And then before it even sort of took, even the aid distribution happened, gunshots rang out and he just started running for his life. And he said, that day I got closer to death than a piece of bread. And I thought that was a really, really sad way to have an experience with trying to get aid. This is an incredibly impossible situation for someone to experience. To not only then try to get aid and then be shot at it's undignified. It has nothing to do with peace or humanitarian, sort of the humanitarian qualities of aid distribution and what they should be founded on, actually. So it was just hard to hear, and it's hard to keep talking to these people who are having just harrowing experiences on their way to trying to get food for their families.
Israeli leaders for a long time, and also parts of the American press, have used this line of reasoning that Hamas has been in charge of the food that's coming into Gaza, and they have been either stealing it, or they've been destroying it, or they've been bargaining with it. And I wonder, I mean, there's a recent New York Times article that says that members of the Israeli military are now saying that they never found proof that Hamas stole the aid provided by the UN. In your time there, with the people that you spoke with, what is the role of Hamas when it comes to gathering or distributing any of the food aid that is coming into the region?
I didn't have any reason to suspect or believe that anyone was experiencing anything or much of anything with Hamas. Now, are there men in this scenario that might have worked in government or have an association with Hamas in some loose way, who are also men who are unstable at this point after 21 months of a genocide and several months of starvation? Are some of those men probably bullying other people and maybe doing that? I'm sure they are. In fact, I've heard stories of that, but they're never connected specifically to Hamas. And so my point is that I think that this is all a line. I think it's a way to skirt responsibility, to justify ethnic cleansing, to justify forced starvation. They keep blaming Hamas when it's really clear that it's almost like it's undignified for me. It's hard for me to dignify that sort of line of thinking with a response, because it just feels like it's completely made up to me. Now, I don't want to overstate and say that there's no one stealing aid or that there aren't problems, but I think that the disorganized way that GHF is handling everything is really the problem. It's not Hamas.
You are describing structurally a scenario where hundreds of people around you that you can see are visibly losing weight because they do not have enough calories in their body, right? And at the same time, there seems to be this sort of war of words. Is this starvation? Is this famine? And we kind of get caught up in that debate. And I wonder, I mean, look, we have, David Mencer, an Israeli spokesperson, he said, in Gaza, there is no famine caused by Israel. There is, however, a man-made shortage engineered by Hamas, right? That was our last question. Then you have a Prime Minister Netanyahu saying there is no policy of starvation in Gaza, and there is no starvation in Gaza. We enable humanitarian aid throughout the duration of the war to enter Gaza. Otherwise, there would be no Gazans. So what's your response to that?
My response is that we often in the West, or even not in the West, get caught up in semantics with each other as if it's important or meaningful at all. If we're even getting to the point where we're speaking about genocide or anyone starving, it's probably really very, it's just like so much later than it should be in the situation, right? Like if we're talking about genocide or whether something is starvation or if there's a policy of starvation, like, right, you can sort of like take these words and unpack them. Ultimately, people are starving right now. I've seen them. I even was hungry for the 9 weeks that I was there. And it's because of a manufactured blockade. There's an occupation. There's also people, community kitchens being there's so much destruction. There's a way where you just have to stop listening to semantics that try to parse out whether something is bad enough and understand that it's so much worse to talk about this for 21 months than to have done something a year and a half ago before this became a human catastrophe that, I don't know, probably has changed the trajectory of so many people's worlds and probably the world itself as well.
This past weekend, Israel announced that it would pause fighting for 10 hours a day in populated areas to try to allow the food aid to get in. A former Israeli government spokesperson, Ilan Levy, said, quote, "Here are hundreds and hundreds of pallets of aid that the UN is letting rot in the sun, and instead of taking responsibility for that failure, they're blaming Israel and pretending that Israel isn't letting this aid in altogether." What did you see? Who's controlling the flow of aid into this area?
I mean, there were hundreds of trucks at the Kerim Salam border. There's no way for aid to come in or out without coordination from Israel. So again, like engaging with these sort of bold-faced, almost delusions of how this is working is hard for me, because my experience was that for me to get to Nasser Hospital, which is 20 minutes away from Deir al-Balah, I'd have to coordinate with the Israelis because it was in a red zone. So any of these red zones, you have to go through. They're in charge of what is going on. It took me 5 hours to get to Nasser and back, and it's 20 minutes away. They are occupying every possible way for any of this to be solved. So for them to sort of blame other parties makes no sense. And I don't know how else to put it, because logistically speaking, every single thing is greenlit by them. So whether there is fuel that you can take a car to Rafah and pick up whatever you need to pick up, or from whatever crossing, you would have to do that through the Israelis. If it's not getting done, it's because the Israelis aren't letting it get done.
Did the Israeli officials that you reached out to have a comment for this story?
No, they didn't. They refused to answer, and then they didn't answer our texts. So, but I think that they've commented a lot. I think that, we've talked a lot about what they've said. And to me, we've got to start listening to Palestinians a lot more, because they're telling us a lot sooner than we're listening. And then we're listening when it's almost too late.
You have the privilege of leaving.
Yes.
And I wonder, Afif, if now, even in the weeks and months that you've been home since, is there a story or a person that kind of gnaws away at you that you check in on often? Tell us about that person or that story.
Yeah, I have so many people now. I have so many people there that are suffering in a way that is unimaginable. And now I can sort of imagine it. But what I want to leave you with, I think what is important to say, is that every person I met in Gaza was extremely faithful, and they were also extremely capable of being appreciative even in the hardest sort of scenario. And it's what made them capable of taking care of each other even when there was no supplies to do so. And so in the wake of my experience there, I'm trying to memorize how they lived, because we've learned a lot about how they die. And I think what's more important actually is how they've been living and what's been being stolen from them, actually. So there's a lot of stories that race through my mind all the time, and I'm texting people all day, every day. So it was an incredible experience, because I think we're struck with how sad it all is, and it is very sad. It's obviously harrowing, but it's also something I think that needs more spotlight, is the fact that these people are vibrant and alive. And that is what is so sad, is that that's being stolen as we speak.
Afif Nasouli, thanks so much for joining us and for your reporting from the region.
I appreciate you so much for having me on the show. Thank you.
Next, to MTV, the first ever 24-hour cable network dedicated solely to music videos. Now, it was launched in the 80s. It's brought hit songs to the living rooms of audiences right across the globe, revolutionizing music entertainment. Now, under Paramount and competing against online streaming platforms, MTV is shutting down its European music channels by the end of the year, bringing that chapter of pop culture to a close. Tom Freston is a co-founder of the once beloved video channel and former CEO of Viacom. And his new memoir, Unplugged, reflects on the birth of MTV and his career. Here he is with Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Paula, and Tom Preston. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Walter. Nice to see you.
You know, I'm going to cut right to the chase. There's just an amazing scene in this book, Unplugged, and I think you know which one it is. It's in a sauna, and it sort of sets the whole tone for the book. Tell me about that scene.
Well, I had gone to Stade at the invitation of David Bowie. We were recruiting rock stars, basically, to be in our I Want My MTV campaign. This was early on in our existence, probably 1983. And we were doing this campaign to try and get our fans to demand their MTV so cable operators would carry us. So we had recruited Mick Jagger and Pete Townsend, and my assignment was to get David Bowie. And I called his manager, and she said, well, you know, David's skiing in Stade, and if you want to come over here, he'll do it. So got on a plane with a 35 millimeter crew. We flew to Zurich, took a train to Stade, long haul. We went out on the slopes, and David was there looking great. He was in his Let's Dance phase. He had sort of figured out what he wanted to do. He was going to ski down this hill and then do a swoosh and say, I want my MTV.
I want my MTV. What?
So we did a few runs, and then it really went smoothly. He's quite good at that. We would then take it back and, post-produce it, so put the logo there and so forth. But at the end, he said, well, why don't you come take a sauna with me at the Palace Hotel, which was the Grand Dame in Stade. And I was staying in basically like a cut above a youth hostel. I went back and told my compatriots in the crew, I said, see you losers later. I'm going to go to take a day of sauna with David Bowie in the spa at the Palace Hotel. And when I show up there, get down, I have a towel around me, and we both walk into the sauna. It's really steamy. There's one other guy in there. He's up like on a shelf, basically, up in the back. And it turns out it's Paul McCartney.
Well, wait, here's one reason I asked you to tell that story, because in normal hands, this would be place dropping, Stade and Paul McCartney and name dropping and everything else. But one of the things you say in the book is that by hitchhiking around, being an adventurer, you learned a sense of humility. And there's a self-deprecating quality in the book that makes all these famous names and places become funny as opposed to arrogant or name dropping.
Yeah, it wasn't being arrogant or name dropping. But those were the two guys of the whole sort of rock and roll pantheon that I was the most intimidated by. Normally, I wasn't that starstruck, but I sat in the sauna, and they wanted to know about MTV because neither of them had really seen it. We talked about this and that and threw some water on the rocks, and for a half hour, little Tom from, my home, Royden, Connecticut, was in there with these two huge stars, and they couldn't have been nicer. It was a great experience and probably one of my greatest stories of all my years there.
So wait, let's get from Royden, Connecticut, suburban kid growing up in a very conventional thing. How all of a sudden, forget about getting to Stade, how all of a sudden were you hitchhiking around the world and doing all these adventures? Where did that risk gene come from?
Well, one that had sort of a pent-up desire to travel. My dad never wanted to go anywhere, so I really went nowhere as a kid. I went off to college and learned how to, in those days you could hitchhike, so I found this freedom on the road, and I had sort of fallen in love with the literature of the beats where, experience was the thing, and you could travel and get out on the road. It's the great classroom, and I gradually built up confidence that I could kind of go anywhere. I was working in an ad agency, and they were going to assign me to Charmin toilet paper, of all things, which wasn't a pleasant. And I had a moment. I said, man, I can't do this. But then this girl called me from Paris who I knew, an old girlfriend. She says, forget it. You can't sell toilet paper. Come with me. I'm going to cross the Sahara. And that sounded like a good idea. I quit my job I was on a plane a week later.
And you say you got off the ferry in Tangier, you're right. And as soon as I disembarked, I was hit with a high. I would chase the rest of my life the peculiar joy of disorientation. Explain that one to me.
Well, you could say it's a bit of culture shock. I had never really been anywhere before that seemed that unusual. And when you're in a place where you don't know where you are, essentially, everything seems a lot more vivid and alive. You hear the call to prayer and you think you're in some kind of time capsule. So I love the feeling of being uncomfortable and then having to adjust to this new altitude. And I would spend a lot of my life in places in what we used to call the third world, traveling around and being in environments that were radically different from everything I had grown up and been around, beforehand.
So how did MTV get started?
Well, it got started with the Warner Communications and American Express had a joint venture called Warner Amex, and cable TV was just getting really started. The notion was, rather than be a broadcaster, we're going to have specialized channels for all these niches for specialized audiences. And we were sort of the tip of the spear in that group as cable was being laid across the country. And it was, cable didn't really reach the big cities, until years later. But in the early 80s, that's when these brands that we know today, like ESPN and MTV, really got formed and started. And it was all very entrepreneurial and seat of your pants and really done on a low cost.
MTV was not just a business, it was actually a cultural revolution. It just changed the way music was. When you helped found it and then ran it, did you see it as just another cable business enterprise, or did you see there was some sort of mission there?
Oh no, we were on a mission. I mean, everyone who worked there, and we worked for very little money. We were like on a crusade. We wanted to sweep the nation and then ultimately the world with this new musical invention that we thought was irresistible. We believed in the power of music. Music was a real powerful force at the time. There had been nothing like this on television. People had never really seen music videos, so it was like a whole new visual vocabulary we were throwing at people. And it's hard to think today how revolutionary MTV was in its earlier years, but it really was unlike anything people had seen before on television. So people would spend untold hours watching MTV, and it really generated a creative renaissance in the video business and the music business, and it became a real force. We became like the biggest radio station in the nation, and then we drove it internationally. We became the world's first really international network. CNN was international, but they were mostly in hotels. We actually had 50 versions in different languages set up in different countries. It really went out to people's homes.
Well, I remember when MTV would just create hits. Somebody like myself say, okay, this just came out, I'm going to get it. Nowadays, with so much niche media and streaming and everything else, how has that changed the way music hits can be created?
It makes it really difficult. I mean, there's more people making music that seems less remarkable. There used to be 40 record companies. Now there's like 2.5 record companies, basically. And there is no monoculture. There is no massive medium. I mean, Taylor Swift is really the exception to the case. A couple of others that really cross over to different demographics. It's hard to discover new music. I mean, if you're younger, you get it through word of mouth. But if you're an older person in your 30s, 40s, 50s, it's hard to really know where new music's coming from. People tend to go onto Spotify and listen to artists and get into this kind of algorithm. And you don't really get exposure to different types of music other than the type you started listening to in the first place.
One of the other things you helped start was, of course, Comedy Central. And that launched the careers of so many people like Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, I think John Oliver, Jimmy Kimmel, perhaps Bill Maher too. And all of them became very much, in some ways, political, defining not just humor, but the politics of it. I think South Park was part of that whole thing.
South Park, yeah.
Yeah, and it's part of now the cultural resistance, both of the Trump administration and other things. Are you surprised that comedians have emerged as sort of the resistance?
Yes. You know, going back to the late 60s and early 70s when there was resistance to the war and to Richard Nixon, it was largely musicians who kind of led the charge and certain cultural figures. It certainly wasn't comedians. Comedians then really didn't have this type of edge. Right now, you don't hear anything from musicians. I mean, no one's standing up at these comedians. They are the front line. And I really got to say, all of these people, the leaders of this new line of resistance, throw Dave Chappelle in there also, all got their TV start on Comedy Central. Amy Schumer's another one. And they have a big impact. I mean, you saw the impact they had and the kind of following they've been able to establish when you saw ABC drop Jimmy Kimmel and had to put it back on.
Yeah, but let's drill down on that. Are you worried about the pressure? I mean, ABC had to drop Jimmy Kimmel partly because of the administration, some blowback on politics. Are you fearful that we're getting to suppress the type of free speech that makes comedy so important?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, in this Jimmy Kimmel instance, I mean, I think in the calculus of ABC determining what to do, they left out one cohort, which was the audience. And I just know from experience from the early MTV days when we used to be thrown off cable systems for one reason or another, the fans would always demand it to get back. Sometimes we would fan the flames of their discontent, but, you know, they're very powerful. And you saw in the case here, you know, they canceled, 1.5 million streaming subscriptions for Disney. They did a lot of reputational and economic damage. So you can't just, I don't think it's that easy. Yes, you could smother it if you really want to be ruthless, but these comedians, it's going to be hard to suppress them unless they start carting away these people and sending them to El Salvador. I don't see that they're going to shut them up.
You know, throughout this book, I watch you as sort of rebellious against all the corporate overlords you have to deal with when you're at MTV, Comedy Central, dealing with Viacom and Paramount. And then, as if the good Lord had a perverse sense of humor, suddenly you become the CEO. What was it like moving from being a rebellious division head to somebody who had to be a CEO of
well, it was a change. It was a change for me because running MTV networks, where every one of our networks was sort of out of the mainstream and on the sidelines, and sort of erratic and experimental, and now I'm having to deal with creative people and animators. It was a place where everything I love kind of came together. But when I got elevated to CEO of Viacom, all of a sudden now I'm dealing with bankers, I'm dealing with Wall Street, I'm dealing with earning calls, a whole bunch of other things. It was a necessary step. I mean, someone said, well, you can't stay a child forever, but you know, it seemed to be something I liked more. But I was able to kind of get going and get in the groove, and I thought it'd be a way to kind of improve my skill set and move my career ahead. But I only had eight months at it before I was cashiered.
Yeah, but you said even when you took over as CEO of Viacom, you said, I knew I was going to be fired. What was that?
Well, my boss, Sumner Redstone, he'd fired all my predecessors. I mean, he was a very... he always do it on holiday weekends, which I thought there was a Frank Biondi, he was a really competent guy, did a great job, but he began to get a little more attention than Sumner liked, so he was out. He was out like on a memorial, on a 4th of July weekend. And then Mel Karmazin came in, who was a very able, extremely able guy. We love Mel. He got fired. He got fired on the 4th of July. I got fired on Labor Day. So I used to think if you made it through Labor Day, you probably had a whole other year without having to worry about being dusted.
Well, in some ways, Sumner Redstone is almost a humorous villain in this book. Tell me more about your relationship with Sumner Redstone.
Well, he's an interesting guy. I mean, he came in at like the age 65 to take over Viacom in a very big battle of the 80s to kind of dispose of the current management and begin to build a Hollywood empire, which he did do. He was very smart. He was very tenacious. He was a lawyer who wasn't afraid to sue anybody. He made lawsuits like a whole new profit center. He'd be suing half our customers. And I got along with him because primarily I had gone to see him before he took over the company and gave him a bill of goods about what we could be if we just had the right resources, which he provided us. And he kind of let us run with a pretty light hand. I mean, I think it was 65, 70 quarters in a row we delivered. So I was not a problem to him. People who were out pretty fast. And he had a sense of humor. He wasn't like the worst guy to be around, but he could be ruthless when he wanted to. But there always seemed to be a thing he wanted to be in charge, so he was not going to take it. At the end, he wanted to fire Tom Cruise. That's when things started to unravel between me and him, because he thought Mission Impossible didn't do as well as it was because he was jumping up and down on Oprah's couch and destroying his reputation, that people hated him. But we told him, he went out and told the Wall Street Journal, I'm firing Tom Cruise. But we said, Tom Cruise doesn't really work for you. It's not actually something you can do.
Sumner Redstone's daughter, Sherry Redstone, just sold your old company, Paramount, and settled lawsuits with Donald Trump in order to get it through and stuff. Tell me what you think of the way she handled that.
Well, I was not a fan. I mean, she really bent the knee and almost started a trend that we saw affect a lot of other, media consolidations and things. I think she felt the drumbeat of this thing coming, which if she didn't close this deal by October 1st, she would have to pay the Ellisons, David Ellison and his father, a $400 million kill fee, which is a lot of money, which would have put an already suffering Paramount into more of a death spiral. And the only way she was going to get it done and pass the FCC was to be nice to Donald Trump. And that's what she did. And in the process, compromised what had been one of the great television news organizations that the country had ever seen. So it was a disappointment, big disappointment to the people who worked there.
looking at today's cultural landscape with, streaming wars, algorithm-driven content, we don't have shared cultural things like MTV creating a hit on any given week. What is that going to do to storytelling and creativity?
Well, good storytelling, if you're a good storyteller, you can still have a hit. I mean, we see that now. There's hits on these various streaming services. The problem is, as a consumer, there's just so many more choices than there ever used to be. But if you have a hit, which is really the rare thing, word will get around and more people will watch it. But it's harder to have a hit record. It's harder to have a hit TV show, and it's not as if people aren't looking, but the attention spans are short. Social media is a bigger factor. People keep saying how interesting TikTok is. And if you ever spend any time on TikTok, maybe I'm just talking like an old person, there doesn't seem to be a lot to engage you there other than that quick sensationalism and moving along. But if you have something good and you're in the mood, people will sit down and watch a long movie or or spend 50 hours going through an episodic television series.
Tom Freston, thank you so much for joining us.
It's good, Walter. Nice to talk to you. Thank you.
Now, outrage over the surging presence of federal agents in Minneapolis continues as the United States reels from the deadly shooting of Renee Good by an ICE officer last week. Minnesota and Illinois are now suing the Trump administration, while new calls to defund ICE are emerging amongst Democrats. But what about actual accountability for Good's death? 6 federal prosecutors quit yesterday after the Justice Department pushed for a criminal investigation into Renee Good's widow. Mike Fox is a legal fellow at the Cato Institute, and in a new article he highlights that this tragedy and its aftermath are part of a wider trend of federal impunity, as he tells Hari Srinivasan.
Christian, thanks. Mike Fox, thanks so much for joining us. Just this past week, Renee Good was shot and killed on a residential street in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent named Jonathan Ross. You wrote recently in an op-ed something that kind of caught our eye, which was that this is part of a pattern. And tell us, what is that pattern?
Yeah, Hari, good to be here. Thanks for having me. So, it's difficult to get data from the government, from Border Patrol, from ICE, from the Department of Homeland Security. There's been a pretty good investigative report from the Wall Street Journal, and then I took what they wrote and tried to parse through. And from what I can gather, since July, the immigration enforcement, be it ICE or Border Patrol, have shot 13 times at individuals in cars. Of those, they've hit 8 people, 2, including Renee Good, were killed. So one of the patterns that's emerged in these cases is as soon as the government shoots someone in a vehicle, and by the government, I'm referring to ICE and Border Patrol, the propaganda machine, Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin, who's the communications guru for the Department of Homeland Security, starts, trying to frame the narrative in a way that the agents are always right and the civilians are always wrong, trying to sanitize their hands, paint the person who was shot at as being some horrific, violent criminal. They were already calling Renee Good a domestic terrorist, taking the side of the officers who were accused of killing them. The reality is, there were many instances where this is what Ms. McLaughlin was saying, and it's been objectively false, and it's been proven false. We've seen a number of instances where she's alleged people have committed these heinous crimes only for the cases to fall apart the second they get into court.
One of the things that you wrote about that I want to highlight for our audience, you said, the tragedy of the Good case is compounded by a legal regime that all but ensures federal agents remain untouchable by civil damages lawsuits. If Good's surviving family members attempt to sue Ross and the agents involved in her shooting for violating her civil rights, they will almost certainly find no remedy in a courtroom. How?
It's pretty clear. If you pull the Department of Homeland Security use of force guidelines, which were last updated in 2023, ICE and Border Patrol are bound by those guidelines. They're required to follow them. It's also pretty obvious that ICE and the Department of Homeland Security are not going to take any remedial measures. They're not going to punish him, dock his pay, fire him, do anything like that. So the only other ways that would be to hold him or other agents, federal agents, accountable for constitutional violations would be criminal case, which is obviously we're not going to see the Trump administration federally prosecute this, and prosecuting at the state level poses a number of legal challenges. And that's assuming that the investigators from the federal investigators with the FBI even cooperate with the state investigators to give them the evidence and the transcripts of interviews and body cam footage and things that would be necessary to pursue a criminal case, which they pretty clearly are trying to screen Minnesota investigators out of. So civil damages would be what most people think. And what that is that's the ability to go into court and seek money damages when your constitutional rights have been violated. In 1871, Congress passed a law that's commonly known as Section 1983. And that law was passed following the Civil War. There were newly freed slaves in the South who had all these wonderful rights on paper, but as they went to vindicate them or to exercise them, they were finding state and local officials in the South were precluding those rights from being exercised. So Congress passed this law allowing private citizens to go into court and seek monetary damages against state and local officials. That has never been extended to the federal government. And if you think about why, it kind of makes sense, right? At the time in the 1870s, the ones violating the Constitution were the states and local governments in the South. They were not the federal government. But also historically, the federal government's been one of enumerated powers. It's very small, was never intended to do a whole lot. Flash forward about 100 years, and the federal government is involved in every aspect of our lives. So in 1965, there's a gentleman named Webster Bivens. Webster Bivens is in his Brooklyn apartment, minding his own business, when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was the precursor to the DEA or the Drug Enforcement Administration, barged in without a warrant, strip searched him, and made an arrest. Mr. Bivens decided to take his case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and 6 years later, the court read an implied right of action to sue federal officials for Fourth Amendment violations. Over the years, the court extended it a little bit, but the court over the past few decades has become increasingly reluctant to extend Bivens. Some of the more conservative justices want to actually get rid of it entirely. There were two cases within the past decade or so where the court just could have extended Bivens to immigration enforcement contexts, and both times the court did not do so, citing unfounded national security concerns. It's also worth noting, of course, that the cases that we're talking about now, by and large, don't even deal with immigration enforcement. Ms. Good was a U.S. citizen. They deal with street-level policing. But because the court has so withered away Bivens and never extended it to the immigration context, and because the statutory cause of action, Section 1983, only applies to state and local actors, if your constitutional rights are violated by federal agents like ICE agents or Border Patrol agents, you are without recourse to get into federal court. And the other point that I would make is, on the off chance that you somehow get into federal court, like in some utopian world where I become a federal judge and allow the case to proceed, you're still not going to get recourse because there's this doctrine known as qualified immunity. And that doctrine was created by the Supreme Court in the 1960s, and it stands in direct contradiction of the statute I mentioned earlier called Section 1983. And what qualified immunity does is it says that unless you can identify a case where the exact same thing happened in the exact same jurisdiction, so unless Ms. Good's family could go into court and prove that an ICE agent violated someone else's rights in the exact same way that their loved one's rights were violated in the Eighth Circuit, which is where Minnesota stands, they have no redress. And of course, qualified immunity only matters if Congress were to codify Bivens, or if the court were to recognize a implied right to sue federal immigration agents in the first place. So these two doctrines working together make it all but impossible to ever get into federal court seeking civil damages.
If I'm hearing you correctly, her family would have more rights for recourse if it was a Minneapolis police officer or a state police officer that did this, right? And you're saying that given the way that the laws are structured today, a federal agent can, in broad daylight, shoot someone and not be held accountable depending on the administration's interests.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's say instead of being shot by an ICE agent, she was shot by a Minneapolis police officer, right? She could sue. She could then get into federal court. She could bring a cause of action under Section 1983. Of course, unless she could find another case in the Eighth Circuit where someone's rights were violated in exactly the same way, the officer will likely benefit from qualified immunity. So it's a monumental battle.
Yeah.
But at least there's a way to initially get into court. Whereas with the federal agent for constitutional violations, there's not. And yeah, I think most people are shocked when they see the impunity that federal agents can act with. They can literally gun a woman down on a public street in broad daylight and face absolutely zero semblance of accountability. That should shock people to the core.
Tell me a little bit about the other cases that have happened, including some shootings. I mean, there's a shooting of Carlitos Ricardo Parias last October in South Los Angeles. Another case of a woman named Marimar Martinez, who was shot by Border Patrol agents in Chicago. What happened in these cases, and how do they fit the pattern that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so both of those cases you mentioned are notable, and they both had their cases dismissed. Ms. Martinez was stopped had an encounter in Chicago where the government again alleged that she tried to run officers or federal agents off the road, tried to ram them, justifying them to shoot at her. Interestingly enough, there was video that showed that the agents actually tried to surround or ram her vehicle. To my knowledge, that has not been made public. I have not seen it. But the government moved to dismiss the case, which the judge granted. And then in the other case that you mentioned, Mr. Carlitos, he had his case dismissed by a federal judge, by a U.S. District Court judge, because the government was not complying with discovery obligations. They would not turn over body camera footage timely. I believe they were also impeding his ability to interface with counsel and assist in his own defense. These are some egregious constitutional violations. So I want to, emphasize that it's not just ICE and Border Patrol who hold responsibility here. It's also federal prosecutors. I was a public defender. I was never a prosecutor. But I can tell you, if I want to bring the full weight of the federal government down on someone, I want to be sure that the agents who are alleging what they did are credible, and be sure that the conduct that they allege actually happened and that I can prove it in court, right? So if I'm later discovering videos that exonerate someone, I should not be charging them in the first place. Thankfully, federal judges are by and large faithful adherents to the Constitution, are putting a stop to it.
I just want to get your reaction to a statement that Tricia McLaughlin made to Time Magazine after this shooting. It said it's a pattern of vehicles being used as weapons by violent agitators to attack our law enforcement. Dangerous criminals, whether they be illegal aliens or U.S. citizens, are assaulting law enforcement and turning their vehicles into weapons to attack law enforcement. Within minutes and hours of an incident, you see the spokespeople or even leadership coming out before there is an opportunity for everyone just to get the facts on the ground of what happened. I mean, is that strategic and tactical?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the end goal is to try to make the government look like the good guys and make anyone they deal with look bad, look like a domestic terrorist, portray a certain perspective. They're professional agitators. They're people with extensive criminal histories. Now, has ICE and Border Patrol arrested some violent offenders with extensive criminal histories? Oh, yeah. There's some cases ongoing for serious charges. I would note, though, that not a single one of these cases that I mentioned coming from July has resulted in a criminal conviction or a guilty plea. Now, of course, that could be because it's only January and cases can take a long time to move. But there's been 4 cases already that I'm aware of where cases have been dismissed. There's been several where they've yet to be filed. It's just a matter of what matters most. Does following the Constitution and vindicating people's rights matter? Or does framing the narrative that Stephen Miller wants pushed around the country and Gregory Bovino wants people to believe is true matter more than the Constitution? I think it's pretty clear which the answer is here.
So right now, you are also seeing lawsuits from the state of Minnesota and the state of Illinois against the federal government. They're claiming, among several things, look, this is a violation of the 10th Amendment. I mean, we are having to push all of our police officers to all these different events instead of the jobs that they need to do, and that the federal agents are terrorizing communities. Now, what's the likelihood that lawsuits like this against the federal government go forward?
Yeah, so it's important to distinguish. So these lawsuits are seeking injunctive relief. What they're doing is they're asking a federal judge, in this case, the state of Minnesota, the state of Illinois, are asking a federal judge. We've seen these cases happen in other jurisdictions. Cato Institute just filed an amicus brief in support of a challenge in Kern County, California, in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. What they're asking is they're asking a federal judge to issue an injunction barring the agencies from operating as they are, from violating the Constitution prolifically, from terrorizing civilians, and just all they're really asking is for the agencies to follow the law and do what they're supposed to do. From what I understand, the Attorney General of Minnesota simply wants ICE to conduct immigration enforcement, which is what ICE is supposed to do. I don't think that's in any way unreasonable. Now, the question as to how successful these lawsuits are going to be depends, right? We've seen some cases where there's been success in the lower courts. I think eventually the Supreme Court's going to have to deal with the merits of these cases. And, by and large, there'll be different questions. The questions in some of them is, can the government stop people or seize people on account of something like ethnicity and the fact that they're outside a Home Depot or working at a farm? If you open the Constitution, the answer couldn't be clearer. We don't live in a world where your Fourth Amendment rights depend upon the color of your skin or what country you were born in. Unfortunately, not everyone agrees with that. And then you have other questions like, are the courts going to be willing to stop what's going on in Minnesota and what's going on in Illinois? I certainly hope so, right? The courts are really our last line of defense here.
But is there anything that Congress can do to constrain how federal troops act on U.S. soil?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not talking about federal troops as in the military. I'm talking about ICE and Border Patrol. Yeah. So Congress controls the power of the purse, right? Congress can give ICE and Border Patrol as much or as little money as they would like, right? Obviously, if Congress were to cut their budget in half, that would dramatically impede their ability to do what they're doing. That would be one way Congress could do it, right? Other things Congress could do is pass laws that have, aggressive enforcement mechanisms. Like, for instance, ICE and Border Patrol agents cannot categorically, under any circumstance, wear a mask or balaclava on the job. They must have their name and employer on them at all times. But those policies alone don't accomplish anything because the government just ignores them. So you would have to tie it into something. Well, if they don't follow it, they lose X amount of funding. Or if they don't follow it, at any time there's some type of proceeding that gets brought in court, there's an inference against the agent or something like that. That's one thing that we could do. The other thing, and I think the most important thing Congress can do, is codify, expand Bivens, and abolish qualified immunity. So together, what that would say is if your rights are violated by a federal agent, you can go into federal court, you can sue under whatever statute this would be that Congress would create. And by the way, the agents do not get qualified immunity. So that question will actually go to a jury. And a jury is the body that the framers intended to adjudicate disputes between citizens and their government. So in cases like Ms. Goods, what jurors would be asked to deal with is something like, was the force used by Officer Ross objectively reasonable under the circumstances? So they could ask questions like, is jumping in front of or walking in front of a moving vehicle contributing to the danger? And is that something that should be considered? These are questions that jurors are supposed to get to decide. But instead, because we don't have a way to get these cases to them, they're not able to do that.
Right now, I think the perception is that the president has the authority and the control of several troops that should be along the border, to be in the middle of the country. Obviously, we understand that he's the commander-in-chief and he can have military operations take place overseas. But right now, I don't know who should be in charge of this level of deployment, if you have 1,000, 2,000 new agents coming into a specific community.
Of course, the president does have the power to decide how to deploy federal agents and in what capacity. But that power is not unlimited. It's constrained by the Constitution. He can't just do whatever they want, unleash agents into communities with orders to terrorize people and openly flout the Constitution, right? So that is not an absolute power. And of course, Congress controls the power of the purse, right? If Congress wanted to put in a no funds may be spent to deploy agents to cities, they could easily do that. It's not in a lack of ability. It's a lack of desire.
Legal fellow of the Cato Institute Project on Criminal Justice, Mike Fox. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Next to the online world, which can be infuriating, isolating, and downright dangerous, with the rise of AI-generated ads, pop-ups, and reams of information, author Cory Doctorow says the internet is getting worse fast, and he's joining Hari Srinivasan to discuss his latest book, examining what's gone wrong and how we can fix it.
Christian, thanks. Cory Doctorow, you've got a new book out called Inchinification, Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. This is now a word that has been in kind of common slang for a couple of years. Some dictionaries are picking up on it too. First, for our audience, what does it mean?
Well, thank you. For most of my adult life now, I've worked for a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation that does digital rights work. I've spent most of my life coming up with different metaphors and similes and and framing devices for this. And Inchinification is the latest one, and it's done really well. It's a way of talking about how platforms go bad, but also about why platforms go bad. So it describes this pattern of platform decay. First, platforms are good to their end users. They find a way to lock those end users in, and once it's hard for them to leave, they make things worse for them in order to make things better for business customers who also get lured into the platform. Once they're locked in, the platform withdraws all of the value from those sellers as well, and eventually it's just a pile of right. Eventually the platform is fully decayed, end stage inchinification. But the more interesting thing is the questions it raises and the answers it proposes for why it's happening now.
So, kind of walk us through examples that people would be familiar with. I mean, you spend quite a bit of time on Facebook, and, there's about 3 billion people on the planet that know what that it's like. So kind of walk us through how this process has played itself out on something we're familiar with.
Yeah, Facebook started with a very attractive proposition. They went to people who were using MySpace, which was the big social media platform of the day, and they said, we will never, ever spy on you. And so people piled into the platform. They identified the people who mattered to them. They got a feed consisting solely of the things they asked to see. But they also locked themselves in. They locked themselves in through something economists call the collective action problem, which you may know as the problem of getting the 6 people in your group chat to agree on what board game you're going to play this weekend or what movie you're going to see. Only when it's a couple of hundred people on Facebook, and some of you are there because that's where the people with your rare disease are hanging out, or where you meet with the people who live in the country you left behind, or how you find your customers or your audience, or just plan the Little League carpool. It can be really hard to go. And so once Facebook knows that you can't leave anymore, they start phase 2 of inchinification, making things worse for you to make things better for business customers. So they go to the advertisers and they say, hey, do you remember when we told these suckers that we weren't going to spy on them? Obviously, that's a lie. We spy on them with every hour that God sends. We have these incredibly detailed non-consensual dossiers on them. And if you give us remarkably small sums of money, we will target ads to them with incredible fidelity. They go to the publishers and they say, you remember when we told these people we were only going to show them things they asked to see? Obviously, that's a lie too. We will cram stuff into people's eyeballs who never asked to see it. All you need to do is put excerpts from your own website on Facebook with a link back to your own website so people can click on it, and we'll just show it to people who never asked to see it. So they get locked in too. They become dependent on us. We know a lot about monopoly in kind of our daily lives. We think a lot about what happens when there's just a few sellers, but it's actually just as bad when there's just a few buyers. So you get this monopsony lock-in, right, where Facebook has control over its sellers, and it makes things worse for them. We see ad prices going through the roof. We see ad targeting fidelity going through the floor. We see ad fraud exploding. Publishers had to put more and more of their content on Facebook. You had to put so much that there was no reason to visit your website. And of course, no one was gonna, because if you put a link to your own website on Facebook, they wouldn't show it to anyone because maybe that link was a malicious link. And so we end up with this kind of deadlock where we are holding each other hostage. The businesses are held hostage by us. The amount of content in our feed that we want to see has dwindled to a kind of undetectable homeopathic residue, and the void has been filled with things that people are being ripped off to show us. And in that equilibrium where all the value has been taken by Mark Zuckerberg and his shareholders and executives, we are all one hair's breadth away from leaving.
So I wonder, look, one of the things that people are going to hear you describe this and say, why doesn't the market just fix this, right? Isn't there a better mousetrap somewhere else? Won't just people walk with their feet?
Yeah, so, we used to have mechanisms that punished companies for being bad to us. And one of them was competition, right? And so, there was a time when people were exodusing from Facebook at speed and running to a new startup called Instagram. You may recall that Facebook then bought Instagram for $1 billion at a time when it only had 12 employees. And what's really interesting about that is that as little as we were enforcing antitrust law in those days, there was one thing that we still said was illegal, and that was to buy a company in order to reduce competition. And Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, sent an email to his CFO where he defended buying Instagram, even though it only had 12 employees, for $1 billion. And he said people prefer Instagram to Facebook. They leave Facebook. They don't come back. If we buy Instagram, we can recapture those users. That's as much of a confession of guilt as you could ask for. And yet the Obama DOJ waved that merger through, just like all of the G.W. Bush and Clinton DOJs. Everyone since Reagan has waved through pretty much every merger, except for 4 extraordinary years under Biden. We haven't had a new privacy law since 1988. The last privacy law America got out of Congress for consumers is the Video Privacy Protection Act of 1988. It's a law that makes it illegal for video store clerks to disclose your VHS rentals. That's the only technological threat you can expect to be protected against since the 1980s, since Die Hard was in theaters. So Facebook can spy on you in all these ghastly ways and do bad things to you. All of the mechanisms that used to punish companies for being bad to you, new technology and interoperability, strong workforce who cared about users, competition, regulation, all of those things were systematically dismantled. And when you take away the forces that punish people for harming you to help themselves, well, you should expect that the people who are in a position to harm you to help themselves are going to go ahead and do it.
You're right about how the erosion of our antitrust frameworks and laws has created this kind of techno-feudalism. Describe what that is and who benefits.
Yeah, this is a term I got from my friend and colleague, Yanis Varoufakis, who used to be the finance minister of Greece. And Yanis wrote this book, Techno-Feudalism, where he tries to draw an important distinction between profits and rents. So profits are money that you get for making something that people like. Rents is money that you get for owning something that people need to make things. And so rents, it's passive income. It's owning a factor of production. If you're Amazon and you own the platform, then everyone who wants to sell to the American public has to pay you 45 to 51 cents out of every dollar they bring in rents. About 90% of affluent households in America have Prime. They've paid for shipping a year in advance. There's no reason to shop anywhere else. And indeed, if they find what they're looking for on Amazon, they don't shop anywhere else. And so if you want to sell anything to Americans, you have to be on Amazon. You have to give Amazon 51 cents out of every dollar you bring in. Apple and Google bring in 30 cents out of every dollar that we spend in an app. So if you're supporting a performer on Patreon, or if you are donating to a news agency, or if you're buying music or ebooks or audiobooks or movies, 30 cents out of every dollar is being captured by these tech platforms. 51 cents out of every dollar is being captured by Google and Meta. And so that's money that publishers and advertisers don't get to keep. So these rents are they're the characteristic of feudalism, right? The difference between feudalism and capitalism, the thing that changed to turn feudalism into capitalism, was the transformation of an economy based on rents to an economy based on profits. Now, both of these have their problems. Neither of them are particularly great for workers, but capitalism was much more productive than feudalism.
I want to give you an opportunity to examine like the business model that sort of Uber has ushered in, because there's so many other companies that are Uberifying whatever their vertical or whatever their market niche is. I mean, because we talked about Facebook, we talked about Google, and it seems like slightly a different type of business, but it kind of follows the rules that you lay out in this book of how these platforms decay.
Yeah, so Google lost $31 billion over 13 years, mostly Saudi royal money. They got it from a venture capital fund called SoftBank that's run by Masayoshi's son. That's the same people who gave us WeWork, and they gave us, now they're backing OpenAI. So the Saudis subsidize 41 cents out of every dollar of all of our taxi rides for more than a decade. All the other cab companies go under. We have a lost decade in transit. And as a result, when Uber starts to raise prices, and they more than doubled them now, and when they start to cut wages, and they've more than halved them now, we're often without any other alternatives. They're able to make a lot of money from this. They're redeeming those discounts they offered in the early days. Uber has really digital, high-tech ways of changing the wages and prices that they pay and offer. So this is something called algorithmic wage discrimination. It comes from a legal scholar called Vina Dubal. And what Uber does is periodically offers drivers a slightly lowball offer, a little less per mile, a little less per minute. And when the driver takes that, if they take the bait, then the offer goes down again a little while later. And it goes down again a little while after that. The idea here is to sort of, in the manner of boiling frog, to get that driver to abandon all the things that used to let them be picky about which Uber rides they would take. And as a result, you have the steady erosion of these wages. Now, that's something that's spread to other fields where you have contractors. Uber misclassifies its employees as contractors and can get away with paying them different wages for the same work. That's also true in fields like nursing, where hospitals preferentially hire nurses as contractors, not as staff. It's how they do union avoidance. And it used to be that if you were hiring a contract nurse for the day, you do it with a staffing agency, and that would be someone local. These days, there's 4 giant apps, each of which bills itself as Uber for nursing. And because we haven't had a new privacy law since 1988, these apps, before they offer nurses a shift, can go to a data broker and find out how much credit card debt the nurse has. And the more credit card debt that nurse is carrying, the lower the wage they are offered. They are imputing financial desperation and charging them a premium as a result. So this Uberization is spreading to other labor markets, and it is connected to a lack of competition, a lack of regulation, the unique characteristics of digital, and the fact that IP law stops nurses from twiddling back, from changing the way this stuff works. If you're a nurse or an Uber driver or someone else who's being paid with an app, you could, in the absence of the IP laws that stop you from buying an app that intervenes, you could get an app that says things like, okay, all the nurses in this town are going to refuse shifts below a certain wage, or all the drivers in this town are going to refuse rides below a certain wage. And it can calculate in an instant how much you're being paid by the mile and by the minute, which is something that can be really hard to do if you're a person and you've got 10 seconds to decide whether you're going to take a ride. There are so many ways that people could push back with technology. They've all been taken off the table. And so what we have is infinite flexibility in technology to exploit and harm you, and zero flexibility in technology to defend yourself from exploitation and harm.
So let's pivot a bit to kind of what is your vision of a future look like, of a good internet? What are the kinds of interventions that we would need to do to build that? I mean, because I think a lot of times the onus gets thrust back upon us. Oh, well, if you just vote with your dollars, if you just change your behavior, if whatever. Well, as you describe, look, a lot of times we don't really have that much of a choice. But on the policy front, are there things that we can do to try to regain some of this control?
I believe in systemic changes. And you asked about which policies would make a difference. Well, privacy law would sure go a long way. There are lots of different people who are angry about the privacy situation in America. And if we could get them all to start pulling in the same direction, boy, could we ever make a difference, right? And the answer to this is a federal privacy law with a private right of action. And we are long overdue for it. That would be a very big one. And I think it's a relatively easy lift. The other stuff's a little harder. One thing that I go into some detail on in the book is how to think about a policy that is administrable, right? So we can imagine lots of things we don't want companies to do, but figuring out whether they're following those rules is really hard. If we say, okay, we have to stop people from harassing people and allowing hate speech, well, you have to agree on what hate speech is. You have to investigate something that someone has called hate speech and see whether it is hate speech. You have to decide whether the company did what it could to stop it. This is like a multi-year process for something that happens 100 times a minute on a platform like Facebook. And so it's just not a great answer. Meanwhile, if you ask yourself, why do people on Facebook who are bombarded with hate speech and harassment stay on Facebook? Well, the answer is that they don't want to leave their friends, right? And so those people stay. So why don't we make it easier for them to leave? Mark Zuckerberg gave you a scraper that would let you leave MySpace but still see the messages for you on MySpace. We could reverse engineer apps to do that. We could use scrapers to do it. And we could also mandate through policy that firms do it. So we could make it so that if you left Twitter or Facebook and went to Blue Sky or Mastodon, that you could see the things people were posting for you on the platform you used to belong to, and they could see the things that you posted in reply. And that would mean that if the company didn't treat you well, you could leave. That is how you vote with your feet and vote with your wallet. But in order to do it, we need policy that makes it possible. As to how you get involved in policy, well, I mentioned a few times that I work for this digital rights nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And these are grassroots groups that work on everything from abortion privacy and limiting the use of digital tools in ICE raids to limiting facial recognition to demanding that public procurements be of tools and software that can be independently repaired and audited. And there's a lot of room to do work even under this federal administration at the state and local level.
Yeah. I did want to ask, look, a company like Uber or Google, they'll hear what you have to say maybe, and they say, look, this is the free market. We have built a product that's successful enough that people with their own power have chosen the costs and the benefits, and they're coming to us and they're doing business with us because we provide them a service that's worth it. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think if that were the case, it would be great, but that's not the case. I mean, if you want to choose someone else's app store for the iPhone, you have to commit a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. If these guys want to be creatures of the free market, then they should stop using state intervention to prevent new market entry and to prevent end users from getting a better deal, from installing privacy blockers in their apps and so on. The rules against reverse engineering have been enormously beneficial to these companies that make proprietary platforms like our cell phones. If you're a web user, chances are you've installed an ad blocker. 51% of web users has installed an ad blocker. It's the biggest consumer boycott in human history. No one's ever installed an ad blocker for an app because to reverse engineer the proprietary platform that the app comes along is a felony under Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998, and it carries a sentence of a $500,000 fine and a 5-year prison sentence for a first offense. And so if they want to be creatures of the free market, well then let them give up the power to invoke the state to prevent people from deciding how their own property works. I'm not the world's biggest advocate for markets as the best way to organize everything, but the one thing that people who believe in markets should believe in is that private property is sacrosanct. And when you buy your phone, the fact that it would make Tim Cook sad if you use someone else's store is his problem, not your problem.
The book is called Why Everything Suddenly Got Worse and What to Do About It. Author Cory Doctorow, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Hari. It was a real pleasure to be on.
Now, continuing our look at the importance of science, and our next guest has just written a book explaining how the most curious and their often silly research can lead to crucial breakthroughs. The salmon cannon and the levitating frog and other serious discoveries of silly science is by Carly Ann York. Here now with Michelle Martin.
Professor Carly York, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, the focus of your book is stories that I bet a lot of people have actually heard about, research studies that they have been told were ridiculous. And you've pointed out the ways in which they were not, or the ways in which basic research has actually yielded some really important discoveries that may not have seemed important at the time, but yielded tremendous benefits. What gave you the idea for this?
Well, the idea of this book really stemmed from my own research as a scientist and my experiences in talking with people about the value of my research. I used to not do a great job of explaining why I did what I did and the value of my work. And honestly, the reason I sat down to write this book was because I knew I had to get a better answer. And so this is my thesis to the question of why curiosity-driven research matters.
You almost have too many examples in the book to name, and some of them are actually, quite hilarious and moving. I think a lot of people remember the longtime Democratic senator from Wisconsin, William Proxmire, who started something called the Golden Fleece Awards. And one of the stories that you tell is about a grant to a Dr. Ronald Hutchinson. What was Dr. Hutchinson studying, and why did William Proxmire think it was ridiculous?
In this particular case, he was looking at monkeys and clenching teeth, and that had direct medical implications. But it was also the kind of research that is easy to twist around. If you want to make it sound silly, you can make it sound really silly, and that's what Senator Proxmire did in this situation.
So he was studying aggression, specifically jaw clenching in rats, monkeys, and humans. And so in 1975, as you write, he used Hutchinson's research in his second example of wasted federal funds. And he wrote a scathing press release, as you said, the funding of this nonsense makes me almost angry enough to scream and kick or even clench my jaw. And you said, in fact, the good doctor has made a fortune from his monkeys and in the process made a monkey out of the American taxpayer. So Hutchinson experienced some really dire consequences from this. What happened to him?
His research funding was stripped from him. He had fellowships stripped from him. It became as personal as like having his fire insurance canceled. So he took a real personal hit because of this. And I think it left a really lasting impression on the scientific community.
Well, he got threats too, apparently, and all of his staff was laid off. And all of his research. Here's the part that really surprised me. He actually sued Proxmire, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he won.
He did.
And what was the relevance of his research?
This research, this is about tension and aggression and how we deal with emotions, and we use animal models often to study very human things. So by looking at things like jaw clenching in monkeys, we can extrapolate that to what we might be seeing in humans as well, with both tension and aggression. So it's not a far step at all to see how this could be really useful research.
Give us another example. Maybe you could do the one about the title of your book is The Salmon Cannon and the Levitating Frog. What about the levitating frog? The levitating frog example. Tell us about that.
So that came from the lab of a Nobel Prize winner, actually, Andre Geim, and he had what he called Friday night experiments, where the goal was to go into the lab on Friday nights and really just like goof off in the lab and try things with zero expectations. So this levitating frog came from a Friday night experiment. He was working with these big electromagnets, and he poured water into the machine, which he did later say was probably not a great idea. But he saw that the water, it levitated, it floated. So once he saw that, he was like, well, what else can we get that we can levitate? And they tried a number of different things, including pizza. And then they went down the hall and they borrowed this little frog from biology, and they levitated the frog. So that was the first time that had been done. It's the first time that they had electromagnets that were strong enough to levitate something as large as a frog. And this can be useful because it provides a microgravity environment without having to leave Earth. So you can do a whole lot in terms of studying what might be happening in space to different bodies without the expense of actually having to send them to space.
Or the risk, frankly, of sending somebody to space. So the whole point of all of this is to explain the value of basic research. So for people who aren't familiar with that term, what does basic research mean?
Basic research is simply curiosity-driven research. So it stands opposed to applied research, which has a really specific goal to solve a problem or to create a product of some kind. Basic research, on the other hand, has no goals whatsoever except to obtain knowledge. So there will be no product at the end of a curiosity-driven research project, at least not immediately. Maybe decades down the road, that information will become really useful for something else, but that was never the intention behind the research.
And has the United States been a mecca for basic research, at least up to this point?
Yeah, so the NSF was created in 1950.
The National Science Foundation.
Yes, and that the whole goal of that foundation was to support curiosity-driven research. And the reason why they wanted to support this kind of research is because it had been underfunded up until that point. The U.S. hadn't done a whole lot of basic research. They relied more on European scientists, and they actually thought that that was a national threat to not be doing our own basic research. So the idea was to create this foundation that would support curiosity-driven research, knowing that there might not be a product at the end of it. Once we had the National Science Foundation in hand, we became the most innovative country in the world in terms of scientific progress. We've had more Nobel Prize winners in the past 5 years than any other country. So it has worked. The goal of creating the NSF and supporting this kind of research has absolutely worked. And I hope we can keep funding it.
Well, you know, your book arrives at an important moment. As we are speaking, the Trump administration cut off nearly $2.6 billion in federal research grants to Harvard and is proposing to slash the National Science Foundation budget by more than half. And it's just interesting because the administration is very keen to bring manufacturing back to the United States. You know, their argument is that this is not just an economic threat to the stability of the country, it's a national security threat. But if that's the case, it would seem that they would want to invest in basic research. They would want to invest in education. And yet, as we see, there's been an aggressive attack on particularly certain sort of elite universities, but also this funding for basic research. How do you understand that?
The only way that I can make it work in my own mind is to say that they must not understand the value of this, because the value it's huge. And honestly, we're not even talking about a whole lot of money. The NSF budget has been like $9 billion. And then compared to like new funds for ICE, which were $45 billion that just came out, it's a really small number. And the payoff with that small number is huge in terms of innovation and being able to be leaders in science in the world. So I cannot think of any logical reason why you would want to cut money out of the NSF. And so I have to just tell myself they must not understand.
So is this a problem of that you all, forgive me, you all as a group, as scientists, just have not done a good job of explaining why your work matters?
Yes, in a lot of ways, absolutely. So it's a complicated kind of a problem too. For a long time, academia really actually frowned upon scientists taking time to talk with the public. It's called the Carl Sagan effect, actually, where the idea is if you spend a lot of time talking to the public and talking to media, then you are no longer a serious scientist.
Oh, a popularizer, one of those. Oh, okay.
So
I got it.
Carl Sagan, he was nominated to be part of the National Academy of Sciences, and he was ultimately denied it because he clearly could have done more research if he hadn't spent so much time on TV shows and books, etc. So that kind of haunts academia a lot. And it's changing for sure. Now people are much more concerned about like the broader impacts of their research and how it's affecting communities. But there still isn't really much formal training that's happening and like real conversation about how to actually get this information to the public in the best possible ways.
You know, you've made the point that people don't always make the connection between the research that's done, how the research was done, and the ultimate outcome. What about drugs that a lot of people know right now, like Ozempic or Wegovy or GLP-1s and things like that? What's the origin story of those?
Ozempic is a great example of this. Ozempic actually came from studying the proteins within Gila monster venom. So a Gila monster...
Gila monster venom, okay. I got it.
Gila monsters are, they're pretty big lizards. They live out in the desert and they are venomous. But they also have this pretty cool ecology where they don't need to eat frequently. And it turns out that one of the peptides in their venom is what allows them to keep their insulin levels nice and stable. And it turns out that that is very similar to GLP-1, which is a peptide that is being used to help stabilize blood sugar in people. Ozempic started for diabetes, and now it's being used for weight loss. But there were decades between the time of identifying this peptide and realizing how it could potentially be useful and figuring out how to actually get it to work well and to get it to be accepted.
So is that part of the problem here, is that some of these innovations take years to yield practical or commercial results?
There was a study that was done that looked at the major drugs that are used in this country, and the number is something like 80% of them ended up stemming back to some basic research question that had no intention of actually creating a medicine. And the average time between that discovery and the creation of a drug was like 30 years. So yeah, it's the long haul. And support of basic research, it means you're going to have to use your imagination and trust that this just building of knowledge is going to ultimately pay off in the long run.
If the federal government withdraws from basic research, is there any other entity that could fill that void?
There are some private institutions. I think that we are going to find a lot more stepping up soon. The vast majority of basic research in this country is funded by the NSF, but I think scientists are finding now that perhaps we become a little too reliant on government funding, especially when it is at the whims of political parties. I think we're going to have to diversify in order to stay resilient and sustainable as a discipline.
You know, the proposed budget, in the proposed budget, the National Science Foundation support would drop from more than 330,000 scientists, students, and teachers to just under 90,000. What kind of real-world consequences do you think that might have?
It's just huge. It's immeasurable to think about that drop in the scientific workforce. It'll affect everything. It'll affect how innovative we can be with technology, with medicine, with our infrastructure. I don't think there's any part of our lives that won't ultimately end up getting touched by that big of a hit.
I wonder whether COVID has something to do with this. I mean, there was a recent survey by the Pew Research Foundation that found that trust in scientists has fallen from 87% in 2020 to 76% in 2024. And that is still, a higher trust level than a lot of other professions, including journalism and, Congress and things of that sort. I mean, let's just be clear about that. Nevertheless, that is a significant drop. And I do wonder whether COVID had something to do with it. What do you think?
The way that I sort of saw that unfolding was science was happening in real time before the public's eyes. And I think that really pointed to some of our weaknesses in how we teach science. Like when you're in high school, you walk into a lab and you're handed a list of instructions and all your materials are laid out there in front of you and you follow the directions. If you do it right, you get some canned result. And that's the science that most people know. And the reality is it's very different from that when you're practicing science. We don't get a list of instructions or materials. We're figuring it all out as we go. And there's a ton of trial and error. And learning new information, it's part of the process. New information all the time, even if it contradicts former information. For us, that's just the scientific process at play. But to the public, it looked like we didn't know what we were doing. And I understand why, but that's how the scientific process actually unfolds. We need to just keep going and gaining all the information, even if it is contradictory. And I think that the confusion comes down to like how they think science should go versus how it really does.
One of the things, though, I'm curious about is that, as you've pointed out, is that the United States in the post-World War II era has led the world in basic research. And I just wonder, though, if the U.S. retreats from basic research, where is that brilliance going to go? Are they going to go back to Europe? Are they going to go to Canada? Are they going to go to China?
I think all of those are options. I've seen a lot of initiatives in Europe calling towards graduate students in the U.S., saying they will happily accept them and support them. I personally have students who I have encouraged to apply abroad because things are just so tough here right now in graduate school. So I think China for sure, and they're always at our tails when it comes to being the leaders of innovation, and Europe as well. But we're certainly going to lose a ton of minds.
Well, Professor Carly in York, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.